The Ghost Legion, the Emperor's infiltrators, spies, saboteurs, and spec ops masters, are the most enigmatic of the Space Marine legions. Little is known about them, and little was ever known about them, even by the other Adeptus Astartes legions and their Primarchs. But this is by design. For most legions, it is easy enough to talk about them and not really have to delve into their Primarch and his nature. But the Ghost Legion, later to be known as the Alpha Legion, is a bit different in that one of their main tropes is everyone in the Legion using augmentation and psycho-conditioning to basically be Alpharius. Anyone in the Legion could assume the role of the Primarch, and being the largest of Astartes, where Alpharius and Omegon were the smallest of Primarchs, it basically resulted in them effectively having an entire Legion who could go anywhere and at least claim to speak with the voice of a son of the Emperor. And this is not something that any of the other legions can do. That, coupled with the Alpha Legion's penchant for disguising themselves as other legions and warbands, often wearing the colors and livery of their opponents to sow confusion, means that they can be anywhere, at any time, whether you know they are there or not. From the lowliest Legion serf, or even servitor, all the way to the Primarchs, the who's who of the chapter is always obscured behind a smokescreen of cleverly interwoven truth and lies. But this goes even doubly for their motivations. So what is it they want, and what is it that they've done, and are they still a cohesive whole? Or are they simply like so many of the other Chaos Legions, and are now just a panoply of disparate warbands, each with their own non-sequitur agenda? Today I'm going to look into the truth and lies of the Alpha Legion, and take a look at what they have done, both during the Age of Darkness and in the current Warhammer 40k timeline. The main focus is on the events of the books Legion by Dan Abnett, Renegade's Harrowmaster, and Alpharius' Primarch novel Head of the Hydra, both by Mike Brooks, and my favorite of all, the recent Alpha Legion novel Shroud of Night by Andy Clark. So, without further ado, the Alpha Legion first makes its appearance in the 7th book of the Horus Heresy, Legion by Dan Abnett. This is the description from the book cover. A great war is coming, and it will engulf the Imperium of Man. The Space Marines of the Alpha Legion, the last and most secretive of all the Legiones Astartes brotherhoods, arrive on a heathen world to support the Imperial Army in a pacification campaign against strange and uncanny forces. But what drives the Alpha Legion? Can they be trusted? And what side will they choose when the Great War begins? Loyalties are put to the test, and the cunning schemes of an alien intelligence revealed. Legion's a great read, and probably one of the best books in the Horus Heresy series. The secrecy the Alpha Legion shroud themselves in is intense and fun at times, but it is in this book that the Alpha Legion are led to their damnation. And this all happens for the Emperor, as Alpharius states at the end of the book. It really is tragic, though. But were they duped, or did they see the future clearly and follow the only path they felt was righteous? The Alpha Legion meets with the agent of a covert group of aliens acting in the shadows, the Cabal. And over the course of the novel, and through all the cat and mouse games and cloak and dagger espionage, the main takeaway is that the Alpha Legion was shown two possible outcomes and were required to make the best choice between two completely horrific and dark futures. The choice they were required to make was so impossible that it is hard to feel that they were in the wrong by siding with Horus. For out of all the Space Marines of the Legiones Astartes who joined the traitors and became enemy of the state number 1, the Alpha Legion alone did it out of loyalty to the Emperor. And this puts them in a very particular place. A different footing in the setting than any other faction of Space Marines, for the Alpha Legion did all the wrong things for all the right reasons, and the other choice they could have made was to do all the right things for all the wrong reasons. But, being the absolute total badasses they are, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion hatch a plan to forge their own future, to take hold of fate itself and play both sides. They could influence events covertly, trying to change the fate that the Cabal revealed was so inevitable. Ultimately, the Cabal's plan failed, though, and the future they saw fell apart as Horus was defeated and the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. So the heresy ended with the Alpha Legion alone of all the traitors staying behind and not fleeing the galaxy, but hiding and working in the shadows and behind the scenes covertly. Something they are masters of, even exceeding the Raven Guard in their capabilities of infiltration and subterfuge. And for 10,000 years, they have waged a long war from within the borders of the Imperium. They have fought Chaos and Imperial forces alike, and they have repeatedly been both the bane of humanity and the instrument of the Emperor's justice in a galaxy that hates them. The Cabal showed Alpharius and Omegon the future of Horus's treachery through the Acuity, and how it would consume the galaxy in the greatest civil war humanity has ever known. But the choice they were offered was to side with the Emperor and he would win, and ultimately chaos would grow in the warp and eventually come through and hungrily consume the galaxy in eternal war, or to side with Horus. And if Horus won, then he would eventually turn upon humanity, sparking an even greater war that would consume all of mankind and eventually lead to the extinction of humans entirely. But chaos, no longer powered by the collective consciousness of humanity, would starve slowly and eventually die. Thus, the Emperor's greatest foe would be defeated at the expense of all of mankind. The novel leads us to believe that they chose to side with Horus, but many other clues throughout the heresy lead us to think that maybe they were secretly just loyal all the time and were infiltrating chaos. And it is at this point where what they're doing, and if they are even cohesive, comes into question, as there are even reports that Alpha Legionnaires led by Omegon slaughtered Legionnaires under the command of Alpharius. It seems the twins may have split the force to hedge their bets, that perhaps one stayed loyal and one truly turned traitor. But it is during the heresy and the scouring that followed that the Alpha Legion seems to have become a bunch of barely associated, disparate war bands, with as many agendas and loyalties as there were individual heroes, as the Legion calls their subfactions. And to me, this is the playing out of something the Cabal's spokesperson, or spokesbug, the insectoid alien Galatro, says to the twin Primarchs before the Cabal reveals the secrets of the Acuity to them. He says, "Cut off one head, and two shall grow in its place." When I was first reading this, I assumed that Galatro was talking about the Primarchs, and how Omegon came to be. That perhaps Alpharius had been killed and his Primarch power was both that he is a perpetual, but also the literal power of the Hydra from mythology. It did have many heads to start, but when Heracles, or Hercules, depending on if you're doing Greek or Roman mythology, severed one of the heads, two more would grow from the wound. Thus he had to cut a head and cauterize the wound with a torch and roll a boulder over the neck to subdue the Hydra. And he had to do this for each head. So I was like thinking, this is Galatro revealing how they have watched Horus and Alpharius closely, as they are the most important Primarchs. And indeed, they are said to be the one who starts all the shitstorm, Horus, and the one who ends it, Alpharius. So he is revealing to Alpharius that they know where Omegon comes from, even if he and his twin don't even understand it themselves. But now I have a different take on what the alien insect meant. I believe he was referring to the strands of fate itself, and of the visions the Acuity provided. I believe he was telling the Primarchs that their Legion alone could stop one of the inevitable outcomes that consume the galaxy, but that it would cause the future to be something more, greater, and different than the past they had just killed. Just a thought, and my speculation, but it seems the Cabal would deliver their message in multiple layers, both literal and metaphorical. I was just really interested that Galatro said what he said about the nature of the Hydra. It made perfect sense on so many levels, but in true Alpha Legion fashion, it caused more intrigue than anything, literally clearing nothing up and maybe even making the waters murkier. But now let's move on to the modern setting, the 41st and 42nd millennium, because that is where we find a very, very different Alpha Legion, and yet in many ways they are still the same. But the one thing that is consistent is they only survive through adaptability and use of their skills. In the modern Warhammer 40k setting, Games Workshop gives us an Alpha Legion that is both complex and subtle. But they are no longer a unified whole fighting for any cause. Each warband has their own flavor and their own unique style, and in the book Harrowmaster we see that This situation is no longer suiting the Alpha Legion warbands. Imperial forces are harrying them across the galaxy, and much blood has been spilled, resulting in unsustainable losses. So Solomon Akura of the Serpent's Teeth Warband is proclaimed Harrow Master, and calls all the various Alpha Legion warbands that he can reasonably get together, everyone that he can actually get in touch with, and gets them together to decide what to do. Ultimately, this is where we see actual democracy in Warhammer 40k's grimdark future. They take a vote on unifying under one leader and reforming what they can of the Alpha Legion into an actual legion again. With the threats of the Indomitus Crusade, being trapped between heretic forces spilling from the Eye of Terror and the Cicatrix Maledictum into real space, and the Imperial forces striving to push them back to hell, the Alpha Legion heroes are trapped between a rock and a hard place. What happens in the book is pretty insane, and Solomon Akura manages to come to power and reunite most of the disparate warbands of the Alpha Legion remnants. Some are chaos-tainted, some are not. Some still hold loyalist sentiments and side with the Imperium, believing they only attack the Imperium to make it stronger, and some do not. One warband in particular wants to be loyal and feels tainted, so they wear barbed wire inside their helmets to mutilate themselves in penance for their sins. And you know what? No matter what their loyalties are or even started as, Solomon Akura declares that it no longer matters. They are all sons of the Hydra, and they are all in danger unless they unify. And this is what I love about the Alpha Legion. They literally put everything else aside to put theirs and their brother's survival above all else. During Harrow Master, Solomon does end up acquiring the Pale Spear, or at least the blade of it, from an Inquisitor who decides he is going to try to bait the Harrow Master. But it turns out Solomon Akura was much smarter, and of course he is. He's a super soldier, son of a Primarch, and he has the intellect of a demigod. But yeah, Akura makes off with the blade of the Pale Spear, the weapon wielded by Alpharius himself, a blade said to be older even than the Necron race. It causes the wounds from it to dissolve the flesh around the cut into an oily black smoke that dissipates on the wind. The Inquisitor ultimately manages to keep the shaft of the spear, but Solomon now has the blade and has a symbol of power that he uses to rally the troops and get everyone on the same page. And this is awesome. The best part, he neither believes nor cares if the spear blade is authentic. He just cares that the Astartes he is seeking to unify believe it is, and that it somehow holds some significance as the Primarch's weapon. But Akura couldn't care any less. To him, it is just a trinket and a means to an end. And this pragmatism is exactly what makes the Alpha Legion so badass and just the coolest legion out there. But now that he is unified and united as many of the warbands as he can, Akura has it brought to his attention that they need a name. They cannot simply call themselves the Alpha Legion, for indeed there are plenty of sons of Alpharius who either couldn't make it to the gathering to vote, or nobody was able to get in touch with. And to speak for them and their warbands by using the Legion name just wouldn't be cool. So they even showed respect to those who couldn't be there and wouldn't know, while at the same time giving a nod to their unified past. Solomon names his new force of united alphas the Ghost Legion, and part of it is because they honestly neither know nor care if either of the Primarchs are still out there. And at that point, legionnaires like Solomon, who had been created thousands of years after the heresy, well, they didn't all even believe the Primarchs even existed. Or if they were just myth and legend from thousands of years ago. All Akura and his agenda are about is not trying to uphold some loyalty their father and his twin had thousands of years ago, if even there is anyone still alive who could claim to know what that was, but simply to survive. They're like, screw everybody, we're just trying to live. And that to me makes them just the ultimate Space Marines. Renegades to the core, whether they serve the Dark Gods or the Emperor, but they stand as brothers and weather whatever storm is thrown at them. And this is to me the best kind of loyalty there is. Not loyalty to their father, to his twin, to the Dark Gods, or even to the Emperor, but to each other, to their brothers, above all else. Yeah, if GW would give the Ghost Legion some screen time, that would absolutely rock. But this is the point where I want to talk about one of the warbands that joined up with Akura and his Serpent's Teeth. The Unsung, led by Cassar, the one Space Marine in all of the entirety of Warhammer, whether we're talking Horus Heresy or 40k, with the absolute biggest balls of all. I mean, if you look up cojones in the dictionary, it shows Cassar. So we're getting into the book Shroud of Night now, which is all about him and his unsung warband. And for real, if there ever was an A-team of Astartes, this would be it. Literal S++ tier, straight foxhound operatives on every level. Okay, so the book begins with an Emperor's Children warband lord named Excrucius having a very bad day. His dudes all got murked hard and he wants to know who has the skills to do something like that. You see, this all starts on a planet in the warp called the Blood Forge, and Chaos warbands have been fighting and dying there all against each other for millennia. During the Scouring, after the Horus Heresy, Cassar and his Unsung found themselves on the Blood Forge. But since it is in the warp, the few hundred years they experience ends up being 10,000 years in real-time space. The Blood Forge was a legendary place among Chaos Marines, and many aspiring champions sent their men in to claim the title of Victor. And they all died, one by one, over the millennia. Cassar and his Unsung being the last warriors standing, but they were stranded without a ship. They make a deal with Excrucius, who was delighted to meet the amazing warriors who could cut down all his men in a single well-laid ambush. He recruits them for what is basically a one-way mission, or at least a very difficult mission, and what is effectively a Dirty Dozen sort of story. The Unsung make the bargain with Excrucius that in exchange for a warp-capable ship and a lift off that damned demon world, they would do his crazy mission for him. It is funny because some of the Harrow want to betray Excrucius as he is a Slaanesh fanatic and cannot be trusted. But Cassar is such a badass, he just tells his guys that even if the Emperor's Children are corrupt pieces of shit, the Alpha Legion had a reputation to uphold, and their word was their bond. Pretty honorable for guys who are supposed to do nothing but lie. And I'm starting to wonder where they get that reputation. But yeah, their mission is to recover some beacon for Excrucius, for they are the finest warriors he's ever seen and work well as a covert ops team of total baller operators. The Slaaneshi Lord's got a whole army of Green Berets he can call upon. But the difficulty and sensitivity of the mission requires he use the intelligence support activity. Sorry for the real-world reference, but it is to emphasize just how awesome the Unsung are. And if you don't know who or what the ISA is, then the point stands doubly. So this story has it all. It gives us an Alpha Legion warband who is only aware of a few hundred years of time since the Horus Heresy. Marines who would have known Alpharius and Omegon personally and fought beside them, but they've seen what happened to the other traitor legions and are disgusted by it, for the most part. There are those who are very much wanting to sell out to the Chaos Gods, believing they have earned the boons that the gods would bless them with and the power they've deserved 1,000 times over should be claimed. And it can be said that centuries fighting in the warp have corrupted every single member of the Unsung in one way or another. But for the most part, it is all just mutations. They, unlike almost any other unit of Chaos Space Marines, are their own men. They serve no one and hate both the Dark Gods and the Corpse Emperor with equal disdain. And that brings them into conflict with every other faction they encounter in this book. World Eaters, Sisters of Battle, Imperial Fists, and the local Imperial Guard regiments all make a presence in this book, which ends in the most epic showdown in any Warhammer 40k book I've ever read. It isn't the one-on-one sort of fight we see on the Vengeful Spirit where the Emperor of Mankind and Horus have their final battle. This is a full-on, over-the-top, cage match style total brawl. I'm surprised Patrick Swayze didn't make an appearance. And in this fight, Cassar delivers the single most badass line possibly ever uttered by a Space Marine. Karn the Betrayer has been harassing everyone he comes across through the entire book, just an unstoppable force of nature. And he's so torqued up on Khorne's warp juice that the air around him is a coalescing mist of blood that is undulating in and out of real space and warp space and gating demons in. The guy's slaughtered hundreds by this point in the story, and he's coming right after Cassar and the Unsung during the climactic battle. And I mean, there's been Imperial Fists and Sisters of Battle and Imperial Guard all fighting Bloodletters, Cultists of Khorne, and World Eaters led by Karn. Hell, even a Bloodthirster. And that's when Excrucius's betrayal becomes super apparent. Long and the short of it, the cultist that the Emperor's Children Lords sent along with the Unsung on the mission was possessed by a greater demon of Slaanesh. And not much after the Loyalist forces deal with the Bloodthirster, but a keeper of secrets is in their midst. Cassar and the Unsung use the anarchy and chaos of the moment to make their stand and shoot anything that comes near, as neither side expected to see a unit of Alpha Legion there fighting anyone, especially holding their own. And that is when we find Karn charge right at the Unsung and just butcher his way to them, slaying everything in his path. He cuts down one of the Unsung and wounds Cassar pretty badly almost immediately, but the Unsung's leader holds his own in the fight, which honestly pisses Karn off. Cassar even gets some pretty good blows in on Karn, who has to stop for a second and literally ask, "Do you know who I am?" And Cassar says yes. And Karn is finding him to be an actual worthy opponent and wants to know whose skull he's about to take, which honestly is part of that aspect of Khorne that comes from him being a god of honor, not just skulls. Karn legitimately sees the act of battle as religious, and killing an honorable opponent, especially one with skill, should be an act of reverence. But Cassar just stands his ground and readies his stance, and in the single most baller line ever delivered in a 40k novel, he says, "I am Alpharius, and I am your death." I hadn't been that choked up by testosterone overdose since John Rambo shot that guy in the chest with an explosive arrow back in '85, and the entire theater exploded to their feet in a roar, as America got revenge for the Vietnam War all in one cinematic moment. But I digress. Yeah, Cassar and his Unsung are from the Heresy era. 10 of them live after the end of Shroud of Night, out of the 100 Unsung who started on Bloodforge. Probably the single hardest Space Marine ever written. The guy goes toe-to-toe with Karn and knows he's going to die. Still puts himself between the unstoppable force that is the Betrayer and his men. And this is where it gets real fun. The Imperial Demon Saint, Celestine, shows up and is battling the Slaaneshi Greater Demon, and Karn sees her and literally just stops attacking Cassar and breaks off to go kill Celestine. It is like he was completely distracted by the shiniest thing in the room, and the Betrayer absolutely massacres Celestine. It is absolutely brutal and literally one of the most gruesome things I've ever read in Warhammer. It was absolutely awesome. But what is revealed in Celestine's dying thoughts is that she's happy to come there and die, as it was the Emperor's will, and that the Emperor had told her to make sure the beacon fell not into the hands of the World Eaters or the Emperor's children, but if it was much better for it to fall into the hands of the Alpha Legion. An Imperial Saint sacrificed her life so that the Alpha Legion could succeed on their mission because the Emperor told her to do so? Let that set in. I cannot stress just how good these books are and just how awesome it makes the Legion out to be. But this is where I want to give my opinion on what this all means and where it's going. I think they're going to bring the Alpha Legion back in a big way. There are more and more references to them showing up in the lore, and much more has happened recently in the novels that I have not touched upon in this video, as it is the subject of future videos. But I do believe Games Workshop is planning to make the Alpha Legion, and hopefully that huge force of it now unified as the Ghost Legion, a much more prominent player in the Warhammer 40k setting going forward. And I do believe they will be returning Alpharius and or Omegon to us soon enough. And I know there's a Space Marine claiming to be Alpharius in the most recent Beckwin novel. Now I'm just reading the first one at the moment, and it will be a minute before I'm done with the second one. But when I am, I promise to come back and let you guys know what I think. It would certainly be no surprise to me at all if Alpharius was hiding out as a regular Space Marine and assisting the Inquisition. Although with the Alpha Legion it is just as plausible that it really is just an Astartes using his Primarch's name. But out of all the legions and all the Primarchs one could rep, especially when fighting alongside Loyalists, to represent the Alpha Legion in the 42nd millennium is absolutely insane. To me, that says that it actually is either the real Alpharius or the real Omegon. And what they're doing is so top secret it is a matter only Inquisitor Lords might be privy to, if anyone. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Will the Ghost Legion be a force to be reckoned with in the setting? Will one or both of the twin Primarchs return? Does the third head of the Hydra represent the path that the Alpha Legion made themselves, despite the future revealed by the acuity of the Cabal? These are serious questions to consider, and certainly add to the mystery and fun of the Alpha Legion. But I think it can certainly be said that when it comes to loyalty, they are one of the most loyal legions, but their loyalty is to one another, as brothers, as sons of the Hydra. When people debate whether or not the Alpha Legion is loyalist or traitor or renegade, the answer is more clearly defined now. Games Workshop have revealed that yes, different Harrows are actually all of those things and more. But with the Alpha Legion, those things are secondary, where loyalty to the Emperor may be the primary characteristic and primary focus of a chapter like the Imperial Fists, and loyalty to Khorne may be the only motivation someone like Karn and the World Eaters have. Even if an Alpha Legionnaire has those sort of things in his personal life, he isn't bringing it along and making it more important than his Legion and his brothers. They always come first. No matter what side of the fight whoa, wait a minute. Didn't Omegon attack an Alpha Legion project led by Alpharius and kill a bunch of... Yes, he did, and yes, it mattered at the time, but no, it doesn't matter now. All that matters now is the survival of the Hydra. Both the Imperium and Chaos know they are out there, and the Alpha Legion is backed into a corner without any allies. Another reason I totally love them. It is the underdog thing. And their level of success, despite where they're located, that being within Imperial space, is a testimony to just how awesome the Alpha Legion is. And I don't care who you are, Loyalist, Chaos, Primaris, Firstborn, hell, even Sisters of Battle. There's an Alpha Legion infiltrator, saboteur, agent, or spy operating within your ranks, even as I say this. For one thing, the Sons of the Hydra know is that knowledge is power, and they've got the dirt on everyone. Want to know who killed Epstein? Ask Alpharius. No, but seriously, the 20th Legion is probably the most interesting of all. I know the memes get old and the confusion thing is hard to sort out, but they really are the most fun Space Marines to read about, in my opinion, and I hope that even if you don't feel the same way, you see why I do. This is not a lie. Alpharius has returned. It has been made all but obvious in the lore that not only is the Alpha Legion Primarch alive, but he is very much active behind the scenes. And now we have it, in glorious confirmation, right on the Warhammer community website. Games Workshop are letting us know that this truth that they've been dangling in front of us recently, for literally years now, has ripened long enough on the vine to bring back the greatest Primarch of all in plastic. Yes, folks, you'll be putting together your own pale spear-wielding warrior of the future, and this does go hand in hand with all the developments in the lore. But we did also see the Pale Spear return to the Warhammer 40k setting on its own in the novel Renegade's Harrow Master, where it is now wielded by Solomon Akura of the Serpent's Teeth. Well, the blade at least, but not the shaft, which is still with Inquisitor Kazan Hart. But he's used the Pale Spear as a symbol of their Primarch to try to reforge the disparate Alpha Legion warbands into one cohesive legion again, all for survival. As the Indomitus Crusade grinds on, the Alpha Legion warbands were finding themselves between a rock and a hard place and are getting sick of running. So they decide to unify. Some are loyalists, some are traitors, some are renegades who reject chaos, some embrace it. But none of the warbands, or Harrows as the Alpha Legion calls their chapter-level cells, claims to know the intentions of the Primarch or Primarchs. They aren't even sure if Alpharius or Omegon ever even existed at this point in history. They may as well be Perseus or Heracles, more myth and legend than reality. Each warband gets to weigh in at the meeting where Solomon Akura consolidates the Legion, and one legionnaire from a Haro called the Faceless uses the name Alpharius. Some were upset by it, but Solomon let it fly so long as the warrior did not intend to use the name Alpharius to bend others to his will and command them. It was all very democratic, but as I was reading this, or listening as I did the audiobook version, it struck me that it was the actual Alpharius, like literally him. And the irony is that Solomon Akura did not even know if the spear was real or fake. And he did not care. To him it was just a relic and a symbol he could use to consolidate power. A means to an end. If it was real, meh. If it was fake, meh. He didn't really mind either way. And for the real Alpharius to show up at a moment when his personal, very distinct and individual ancient weapon shows back up. And with such disregard by the wielder. And yet the guy is playing it off to the other Alpha Legionnaires that he regards it as absolutely sacred and sacrosanct. Well, that may just be a run-on sentence, but it is also the most Alpha Legion thing ever. And that isn't all there is to this one. When you look into the Haro known as the Faceless, what do you see? Simply nothing. Origin, Alpha Legion. Leader, unknown. Base of operations, unknown. Colors, unknown. Chaos dedication, unknown. Strength, unknown. All there is question marks. And the fact that the other Traitor Legion warbands operating in the Ultimate Segmentum don't really get along with them so much. This is all perfect Alpha Legion to a T. But this is not the only place where a possible real Alpharius or Omegon has shown up recently in the novels or other places in the lore. In the Bequin series, otherwise known as Eisenhorn vs. Ravener, we get to meet a rather beefy space marine who goes by the name of Deathrow. And this is one of the best characters ever. Beta Bequin speaks to him the first time they meet, and he doesn't even reply. He just stares at her. I was reading the description of him and his armor and how faded and worn it was and no paint still on it, and about his dog. He literally has a dog. And I'm immediately thinking, this is Alpharius. Then later in the book she asks his name and he says, Alpharius. Which is not the usual I am Alpharius you get, but he's going by another name and she wants his true identity. And he gives it to her, with the knowledge that she wouldn't recognize it as any different than any other name for a Space Marine. It could have been Titus or Zabriel or Tom, Raistlin or Mike. But he gave her an honest answer, because the Alpha Legion is actually very, very honest when it is warranted, and honorable, as we see even with renegade Alpha Legionnaires like Kassar of the Unsung. So instead of Brother Zarbek saying he is Alpharius, you have Alpharius going by the name Deathrow, acting all OG and hanging out with Inquisitor Eisenhorn, doing the good work of the Emperor the funnest way possible, through absolute heresy. Here's an excerpt from Pariah where we get to see for ourselves that the Alpha Legion Primarch is indeed with us. Teak, the smiling one, stepped out of the darkness so we could see him. The rain streamed off his pink and black armor. His 2 gold ribbons fluttered from his hip. I've been looking for you, he said. He held up Shadrake's sighting glass like a lorgnette. It had a crack in it where I had dropped it. I've been looking for you for a while. You left me at Feverfuge. You hurt me with that word. I had to fight those animals. Fight them. They cut me. I hurt them back. He looked at me. I thought we had an understanding, Mamselle Beta Bequin, he said. I thought you understood that you belong to the children now. Please, I began. You belong to the children. I have come to take you back so that we can continue our business together. Still smiling, he raised a warning finger. No bad words now, no pariah tricks. Come with me, or I will kill him and maim you. I truly wished I had the word, but since I had said it to him in the ancient house, it had fled from my memory again and could not be recovered. He took a step towards us. He reached out his hand to me. Where the rain ran off his gleaming armor, it looked like blood. Lightburn snatched out his revolver and aimed it at Teak. Renner, don't, I cried. He will kill you. If I don't, I'd better just kill myself, Renner snarled back. Would you do that? Asked Teak. Could you? Save me the effort. Then Teak vanished. Something smashed into him from the side and ripped him out of our line of sight. It was as though he had been plowed down by a runaway tram. Lightburn and I flinched at the impact and ran to look. Deathrow, the warblind, had the monster on the ground, his hands around Teak's throat. Deathrow was almost as big as the warrior of the Emperor's children. He was systematically bashing the traitor marine's head against the pavement of the filthy slum alley. Rain hosed down over them both. I heard the buzz of his optic visor. Teak rallied and smashed the warblind off him with a formidable punch. The impact of powered fist on plate armor made a sound like a safe door slamming. Deathrow left the ground and smashed into the wall behind him, cracking ancient, soot-frail bricks. Teak was up, rushing the warblind. His ribbons were swords. His smile became a killing rictus. The cattle dog bounded out of the side street and stormed into him, seizing his left wrist in its massive jaws. The warrior of the Emperor's children howled out in dismay. It was not a cry of pain. He simply seemed revolted at the thought of being touched by a vermin dog. He lashed out and sent the animal flying across the yard. But the dog had bought Deathrow time. The kill gang chief had drawn his oil-dark broadsword. He came at Teak and they clashed. The huge, oiled blade met and blocked both of the darting golden longswords. Sparks flew. I heard both warriors grunt with effort as they traded potentially lethal strokes and thrusts. Teak had the clear advantage. The kill gang chief was supernaturally strong. I knew this well enough, but he was not in the same class as the traitor Astartes. Teak would kill him. He would outstroke and outfight him. His swordsmanship was far greater. The smiling one landed a terrible, scouring blow that seemed to rip part of Deathrow's visor and face plating away. Deathrow's head snapped to the side. I saw fluids spurt into the rain. Cables tore out and fizzled. Deathrow staggered backwards, leaking blood, the side of his head mangled. Teak closed for the kill, but he paused. He had seen something. Something had stopped him in his tracks. I realized he had glimpsed Deathrow's face behind the ruptured visor. How? He began. The distraction was momentary, but the smiling one had dropped his guard. Deathrow plunged his sword into the gap. The oiled black blade went through the traitor marine's belly and shredded out through the back plating of his armor. Blood splattered onto the wet pavement behind him, black as pitch. Shorn servos shorted out. Teak screamed. This time it truly was pain. It was pain and outrage and horror. Teak tore himself off the blade impaling him and lurched back across the yard. Black blood was gushing from his wound and mingling with the rain. His face was ashen. He was still smiling. He turned, and the night took him. It was as if the blackness and the rain had conspired to become a curtain to allow his exit. Teak left no trace behind but a few pink rose petals floating on the gurgling pools around the drain. Deathrow sank to his knees, breathing hard. He kept his back to us. He raised his hands to his face and tried to push his damaged visor back together. I took a step towards him. The cattle dog trotted up and stood between us. It glared at me, but not unkindly. "Deathrow?" I said. The dog growled. "Beta." "Can I help you? Are you hurt? Let me..." The dog growled again, a negative. "You saved us. You saved me." The dog remained silent. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance this day," I said. I looked at Lightburn. He gestured urgently for me to follow and get away. I stopped and looked back at Deathrow. "You're one of his, aren't you?" I said. "You're one of Eisenhorn's specialists. He sent you to shadow me." There was no answer. "Didn't he?" "Yes," said Deathrow. "Who are you?" I asked. He rose to his feet and turned to look at me. I saw that the visor was smashed and hanging off, and part of the scarred and rigid tissue of his face was torn away. But it was a mask. There was another face beneath it, a face that Teak's blow had partially exposed. I could not see it clearly, but even in the gloom I could tell that it was handsome and noble. "Who are you?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment. "I am Alpharius," he said. He turned, and he and his dog were quickly lost in the downpour. So we have more mentions of the Alpha Legion Primarch, or at least one of them, in the lore. But these were the two that I really thought stood out as strong possibilities of actually being Alpharius, Omegon, or both. And I'm very excited to put together a model wielding a pale spear, no matter who it is. Games Workshop could not have been any less subtle with this particular rumor engine image. It is like tearing off a bandage that has been festering and it pulls all the hair around it out with it. I mean, this one was a real shock. The implications are massive. Alpharius is not returning. He's here. And he has been all along, in the background, manipulating events and making sure that the Cabal is ultimately thwarted, and humanity is able to carve its own destiny out of the ashes of the heresy. Or at least that's my take on what he's probably all about. And with Eisenhorn in the picture, it's perfect, as they would be using all sorts of absolutely heretical methods to achieve these goals. But one thing's for sure, whatever they're up to, they're doing it for the Emperor. The Alpha Legion's lore has changed a lot over the years. But of course, the way Games Workshop has done this has left us with a lot of questions, and members of the community still quoting old, outdated lore as canon. In this video, I'm going to debunk one of the biggest misconceptions in Warhammer 40k, and take a look at the death of Alpharius at the hands of Rabute Guilliman on Eskrador. And before you say, "Hey Inquisitor, Solomon Akura mentions Eskrador in Harrowmaster, so it's canon now, again." We'll get to that at the end of the video. But I'd like to start with explaining where this tidbit of lore comes from. A piece of Warhammer history that gets thrown around a lot in YouTube comments, as if it has a ton of weight behind it. And let me tell you guys, it does not. And even in universe, at the time, was quite questionable, possibly heretical in origin. Next time your friends tell you that it is 100% confirmed that Guilliman killed Alpharius, you can just show them this video instead of giving them the usual clop in the chops that is likely to result in even more brain damage than they already suffer from. So let's get into this old lore from 2003. Yeah, it is from years before the Horus Heresy series came out, or there was even a tabletop game for it. At this time, the Heresy and what we knew of the Primarchs was all just deep lore within the lore of Warhammer 40k. Eventually, Games Workshop started giving us little updates about this backstory in the form of Index Astartes articles in White Dwarf. So, this most epic of battles that Ultramarines simps love to gloat over came from White Dwarf 277 in the UK and 276 in the US edition. Let that sink in. I must have heard about how Guilliman killed Alpharius in the books like 1,000 times now. But yes, it was just an Index Astartes article on the Alpha Legion. And everything else, I mean literally everything else in this article has been changed in the lore since then. So why is this epic battle somehow still canon? I don't understand. And I mean still canon in massive air quotes. As when we look at where the account comes from, it is delivered to us from an Inquisitor Craven, and this particular Inquisitor was later accused of heresy, of being an agent of the Ruinous Powers, and, if I recall correctly, was burnt at the stake for this heresy. Nothing he said can be considered reliable and honest. But that said, let's see what this heretic has to say about the Alpha Legion and their Primarch Alpharius. At this time, Games Workshop had not yet invented Omegon. There was only Alpharius. So he's not found in the usual way, but in this old lore, he was found by Horus as the War Master was prosecuting a war against a non-compliant human civilization. His flagship was attacked by a bunch of small, ineffective, hit-and-run attacks from 1- and 2-man fighters. So he took the bait and followed those small ships into a minefield, intending to unleash the wrath of the Imperium upon them. As the mines blew massive holes in Horus's flagship, which I'm unsure if it was yet to be named the Vengeful Spirit, a strike team of this world's elite commandos boarded the War Master's flagship and were shot in the head almost immediately upon arrival. But one dodged aside, taking only a slight graze on the cheek by a bolt round, and striding right up to Horus, meeting face to face, shrugging off bolter fire, taking only minor damage from it. The warrior was the equal in stature to the War Master, a massive giant with green eyes, a full foot taller than the sons of Horus Astartes on the deck. And the fire ceased as Horus raised a hand, gesturing to his sons that it was okay, as Horus and Alpharius met for the first time, recognizing each other as brothers immediately. Horus Lupercal had found the last of the Primarchs. And Horus and Alpharius kept this a secret from the Emperor for months while they got to know one another and learned from each other. Plotting, bonding, planning, and scheming. The two brothers developed a close bond, but when Alpharius was revealed to the Emperor and his other brothers, he made no other friends. Guilliman was a total dick to him, literally just talked shit to him and turned his nose up like he was better than Alpharius. Basically, Alpharius was proud of how he had trained his legion and officers to take initiative and adapt to any situation. Alpharius was told by Guilliman what actual and proper Space Marine tactics were, and that his style of subterfuge and coordinated attacks were anything but codex actions. Yeah, even in this pre-heresy point, even in this old, outdated lore, Guilliman was up his own ass about how great he was at war and how awesome his legion was, and was already writing the Codex Astartes and trying to bully his brothers into adopting his style of fighting. And Alpharius wasn't hearing anything about this from Guilliman. He was a bit taken aback that his brothers all thought his style of fighting dishonorable or cowardly, even though he had defeated an army that outnumbered him 100-1. Alpharius had let this army dig in and take strong strategic defenses for days or even weeks ahead of time. And this is what his brothers were so critical of, because to them, they saw an enemy and just wanted to charge right in, like Space Marines usually do. But Alpharius had sown the seeds of deception throughout the enemy's ranks, and had infiltrated from within, placing operatives far ahead of time. And when the moment to strike came, the enemy found a massive hole in their main line, as a series of massive explosions wiped out much of their defenses, and more explosions decimated the enemy from deep within their bastions and fortifications. By the time they knew what hit them, it was over. And for this, Alpharius was expecting to be praised, yet only Horus Lupercal showed him any respect for a job well done. Guilliman told Alpharius that he and his legion would never amount to anything, and that the Ultramarines already had centuries of honors and victories under their belts, that the Alpha Legion would forever be in their shadow. But Alpharius was asked why he didn't take the normal Space Marine route of just attacking them head-on, and was criticized for the perfectly executed action he conducted taking too long. He simply stated, "That would have been too easy." And it is this sort of snarky, put-you-in-your-place, quippy type of personality that made all his brothers think Alpharius was a dick. Even his name and that of his legion was a slight, a jab at Lionel Johnson and the 1st Legion, the Dark Angels. Nobody really knew what to make of him, and Alpharius spent very little time with the Emperor getting to know him, and even less with his brothers, except for Horus. So in many ways, the Alpharius of 2003 is very similar to the one we have now, since the character has been fleshed out a lot more in the Horus Heresy series. But keep in mind that at this point in time, we really only had 2 sources for art of the Alpha Legion's Primarch. We had the original John Blanche piece, and we had the art from the Horus Heresy collectible card game. And I have to say that the original concept for Alpharius was a far cry from what he looks like today. Wild, spiky hair, almost like one of the Wood Elf models from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And elegant, finely fitting armor that did not flare at the ankles, but was something more akin to Sanguinius's armor. But the dynamic between Alpharius and his brothers was pretty much exactly the same as it is today. He was an outsider who was never accepted or understood by his brothers. And that was really no sweat to him, because he didn't really want much to do with them either, and considered himself completely superior to all of them, while at the same time letting them all underestimate him, So he still had those tropes of being the perfect infiltrator, the perfect spy. It is not known if he was reporting all that he learned and did to Horus, but it is known that he did not do so with the Emperor. It's thought, however, by this Inquisitor Craven, that Alpharius was not honest with the War Master either. That just by his very nature, Alpharius always kept some of his cards close to his chest, and many of his thoughts and actions to himself and his legion. And when it comes to legions, this version of the Alpha Legion is pretty much the same as it is now. They differed greatly from all the other legions and operated in ways that Guilliman would have found absolutely heretical. Particularly, by not adhering to a rigid command structure, the Legion was able to present any Astartes they needed to as Alpharius, and that did not sit well with Guilliman. He considered it disrespectful to the name of a Primarch that a mere Astartes could be allowed to use it. To Alpharius, his name was nothing more than a tool, nothing more than syllables strung together to identify him. But by using it the way he was, it had been allowed to become something more. Guilliman didn't see it that way, nor did he like the fact that the Alpha Legion used regular, unaugmented humans as operatives and even trusted advisors, allowing secrets to be shared with beings that Guilliman considered inferior. To Alpharius, all his operatives were tools, and he was doing the Emperor's will. So how could he be wrong to use the right tool for the job when it was by the will of their father? So the stage is set for the two brothers to butt heads. They disagree more on everything, from tactics to the basic roles of their legions, on an absolutely fundamental level that just cannot be reconciled. Guilliman actually wants to do something about this, and intends to bring Alpharius before their father and be questioned / face justice. But this is overshadowed by Conrad Kurz being put on the spotlight as the Night Lord's terror tactics came into focus and became the focus of attention, and the relationship between the Imperium and the Night Lords and their Primarch fell apart. But before Guilliman could see Alpharius thrown to the wolves, the Horus heresy broke out. And this is the fun part. In this account, the Inquisitor known as Craven does not truly know if the Alpha Legion actually participated in the drop site massacre on Istvan V. He openly states that some sources account for their being there, and others do not. However, even in this Inquisitor's journal, we see later that there is no doubt that the Alpha Legion sided with Horus, although it is interesting that they may or may not have participated at the battle on Istvan V. And that battle is much different in this old lore. This questionable journal of Craven's, it suggests that there were only 30,000 total Loyalist Marines there, and that out of those 30,000 Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders, only 5 Marines total survived. Literally 5. Somehow they got away. I'm glad that this part of the history has been updated to reflect more accurate numbers. But whether or not the Alpha Legion was on the ground, Inquisitor Craven openly states that he believes the trap to have been orchestrated by either Alpharius alone or Alpharius and Horus coming up with it together. Either way, he thought that it had the feel of Alpharius all over it, and I for one can agree with that. He knew baiting others into traps better than anyone. But as the Horus heresy dragged on and the Solar War kicked into full gear, the Ultramarines and the Alpha Legion would come to blows on the planet of Eskrador. Now, it is not known to Craven whether or not the Ultramarines found the Alpha Legion and chased them to Eskrador, or if the Alpha Legion baited them. There's evidence to suggest both, but either way, the battle between the 13th and 20th Legions would delay Guilliman from relieving the Loyalists and providing reinforcements against Horus and the traitor legions assaulting Terra. So, knowing that the Ultramarines had the much larger and more powerful fleet, Alpharius chose to face Guilliman on the ground, and so made Planetfall first. He established a base there and dug into a fortified position high in a mountain range at one of the planet's poles. Guilliman and the Ultramarines came down, wanting to revenge themselves upon one of the traitor legions. But they were systematically cut to pieces. Their tanks and vehicles were no good in the terrain, and every single tactic they used was one with which Alpharius was familiar, because he was smart. He was smart enough to read Guilliman's Codex Astartes that he wouldn't shut up about. so Alpharius literally had access to Guilliman's playbook. After getting bogged down and ground down in a brutal war, Guilliman finally decides to do something out of character and leads an assault on the command center of the Alpha Legion. He does something that wasn't in his playbook, and he teleports a force right in and deploys others via Thunderhawk dropship, assaulting the Alpha Legion command and Alpharius directly. Funny how Guilliman just didn't get it at all, even then. What happened when Hercules, or Heracles, cut off the Hydra's head in mythology? 2 more grew back in its place, but I digress. The attack was unsupported, and the attackers had no supply lines at all. They were basically making a last-ditch effort to root out the Alpha Legion, and the surviving account, which Inquisitor Craven uses as his supporting argument for what happened, has been brought into question. It is the account of an Ultramarine sergeant, possibly, a member of the strike force of some 3,000 Marines who assaulted the Alpha Legion HQ. But the validity of the document has been questioned by many Inquisitors, as well as the Ultramarines themselves. Despite being deemed as pretty much fictitious by both the Inquisition and the Ultramarines, this account still made its way into Inquisitor Craven's diatribe, Lessons of Strife. I must also point out that at this time, Games Workshop was still regularly referring to Terra as Earth, and the documents that Inquisitor Craven claimed were the Ultramarines' account of events were found somewhere earthward of Eskrador. That doesn't sound too awful convincing, does it? Anyway, what happened is a bloody battle where the Alpha Legionnaires found themselves outnumbered 5-1. And I must tip my hat to Guilliman, even though this definitely didn't happen, for taking the Alpha Legion off guard. That cannot be an easy thing to do. So the Ultramarine goes on to say that they pressed the attack despite horrific losses, and the Alpha Legion was chewing through them with their heavy weapons stationed on higher ground and fortified positions. But he gives some hokey line about their resolve and states the Alpha Legion had too few guns to take them all down. By this time, the Ultramarines have whittled the Alpha Legion down to around 500 Marines left, fighting at the command center. So Alpharius leads a charge himself, down the mountain, and just starts butchering Ultramarines. The Marine giving his account says that none could stand before the might of the Primarch, and many were cut down by his power sword. Yes, this is before they had really defined Alpharius much. In fact, this bit from 2003 is literally the first thing I ever remember reading about him in any lore, anywhere, that was more than a line or two. But yeah, there's no pale spear yet. And the Primarch fights with his power sword. Although at one other point in the account, it's mentioned he's using a chain sword, but then it's right back to a power sword. Probably typo. The next thing that happens is the Ultramarines advance halts in the face of the Primarch, and the viewpoint character states he was forced to recite the Canticles of Faith, which just goes to show you how early this lore really was. There was no Imperial truth yet. The Space Marines were praying during the heresy? So yeah, this is before they had given us any real details at all about the heresy. So as the Marine is praying, Guilliman strides forward like a total boss and comes to meet Alpharius, ignoring all the carnage and slaughter playing out all around him, walking through gunfire and blades swinging, chain swords whirring, and Space Marines dying. He makes straight for the Hydra. The battle was nothing like any other Primarch battle we have ever seen. I think of it a lot like the end of Kill Bill Volume 1 in the duel with Lucy Lawless. But it's quick, so I'll quote it so you know exactly what was said to have happened. Again, said by a very, very disreputable source, or so the Imperium claims now, 10,000 years later. The two Primarchs stood before each other. They were equal in stature, both clad in shining power armor and each wielding a glittering power sword. But where one was noble, the other was craven. Where one was loyal, the other was a betrayer. All other combat ceased as we watched them. There was a long pause, neither Primarch moving an inch. Then both struck in an instant. Each sword made a single stroke, then both were still again. For a second, the two great men stood, facing, before Alpharius slumped to the ground. So, after the Primarch fell, they killed the rest of the Alpha Legionnaires at the command center and then held a vigil for Alpharius before commencing the fight against the other sons of the Hydra on Eskrador. They burned his body on a pyre, and Guilliman allowed his Marines a moment of reflection and prayer. Again, this should show you how old and outdated this account is. Even if it weren't a lie in-universe, it would still be more of an ancient myth and legend type of account. But the Alpha Legion was supposedly undeterred by the loss of the Primarch, which took the Ultramarines off guard. They proceeded to all but wipe out the Ultramarines on Eskrador, operating with complete, unrelenting efficiency, something the Ultramarines knew they would not have been able to do themselves had Rebute Guilliman died, which by the time the fighting on Eskrador was over, nearly happened. Guilliman barely got away. His legion was nearly obliterated, and he didn't get to go reinforce Terra, so it went down as a huge L for the Blueberries and a W for the Hydras, despite the apparent loss of Alpharius. Now, what is really interesting is that this Index Astartes article ends with a snippet about the Aquila Conclave and explains the context in which Inquisitor Craven's account is to be considered. And remember, I said this guy was not to be trusted? Well, it seems the Inquisition at the time thought so too. Again, quoting the source material directly, "It has never been established if members of the Alpha Legion exhibit the same unnatural longevity as other Chaos Space Marines, who can apparently live for many thousands of years. This phenomenon is greatly attributed to the Traitor Legion's existence in the Eye of Terror, where the laws of time and space do not apply, so it would follow that the Alpha Legion would not be affected. However, if Alpha Legion Space Marines have more normal lifespans, then one must ask how losses are replaced." In his address to the Aquila Conclave, an impassioned Inquisitor Craven warned, "The only possible answer is that new Chaos Space Marines are being recruited and genetically modified somewhere within the Imperium. And yet Terra refuses to acknowledge that there is even a serious threat. They are all around us, just look over your shoulder. Perhaps when you are murdered in your own cities and in your own homes, then you will see I am right." Shortly after the conclave, Inquisitor Giroux publicly accused Craven of consorting with traitors and conspiring to organize cultist uprisings on the worlds of Cartha 4, 5, and Arcos 2 in the Corin subsector. Giroux challenged Craven to appear for trial and to face the evidence against him. However, Craven's current whereabouts are unknown. Of course, this development has called into question the reliability of all Inquisitor Craven's research. And, as he was the leading scholar of the Alpha Legion's history and current activities, much of what was known about them must now be considered a lie. If, as Giroux claims, Craven has been compromised by the very traitors he sought to investigate, then everything he has said must be considered misinformation and propaganda invented by the Alpha Legion. So everyone, it seems that those who've been clutching the Guilliman killed Alpharius pearls for 22 years now didn't bother to read the text in the window. The best lore was always in those snippets, and they really helped draw us into the universe by adding that extra depth and flavor. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Inquisitor Craven gets burned at the stake for heresy when the Inquisition catches up with him, but I do not remember where that lore actually came from or if I'm misremembering it. His fate is not mentioned in this Index Astartes article, though. But Inquisitor Romanov, what about Solomon Akura mentioning the battle on Eskrador in the book Harrowmaster? Well, what about it? Solomon doesn't have any of the answers when it comes to the history of the Legion or the fate of the Primarchs. He states as much openly. But he's been told the Eskrador story had some truth to it his entire life as a Space Marine, so of course he'd believe it. The other option is that Games Workshop is going to make it canon again, fitting the events into the sort of mold that would be required to make it conform to the Horus Heresy as we know it today. It wouldn't take much effort. But we must also consider Guilliman has never stated he fought Alpharius, but the Alpha Legion did attempt to assassinate him, and nearly succeeded. We'll know what they plan to do with Solomon Akura soon enough, and maybe it will shed more light on Alpharius and his ultimate fate. But keep in mind, this lore of Guilliman versus Alpharius simply came from White Dwarf nearly 22 years ago, before the novels got written, and long before Alpharius even had a twin in the lore. It may as well just be myth and legend, as that is exactly what it is in universe.